I would think you're doing a lot better than Alex Murdaugh this morning. That's just I'm just guessing. I'm just guessing.
I would hope so.
Yeah. All right, Thomas. So obviously the breaking news, Alex Murdaugh found guilty, and then he was sentenced. We'll get to all that. But here's what it sounded like in the courtroom as they read the verdict. Here's exactly what it sounded like. And by the way, while all this is going on, and you're probably used to this with some defendants, Alex Murdaugh did not show any emotion, but here's what it sounded like in the courtroom.
Versus Richard Alexander Murdaugh, defendant. Indictment for murder, SC code 16-3-0010, CDR code 0116. Verdict, guilty. Signed by the forelady. Date 3/2/23.
All right, so there you go. What was your first reaction, Thomas, when you heard that verdict?
Well, I already knew it was going to be a guilty verdict. Anytime the jury comes back quick, that's not good for the defense. I'll tell you, not in a murder case. I was actually shocked that they came back that quickly. Sometimes as a defense attorney, when I was a prosecutor, my defense attorney friend said this, and now as a defense attorney, we say this. Sometimes you go into a trial and it's just rock solid evidence against your client, and you know that, and you're saying, how long can we keep the jury out? Like, how long can you keep them deliberating? For a few days. But in a murder case that takes 6 weeks to try, and the jurors have been sitting through all of that evidence, to deliberate that quickly in under 3 hours and come back with a verdict, you're walking in that room, you know it's a guilty verdict. There's no way they're coming back not guilty in 3 hours. There's no way they're coming back hung in 3 hours.
Is it a situation where you think at some point early they just said, okay, raise your hand if you think he's guilty?
No, I know exactly how it is. So one of the jurors actually came out and did an interview, and he said, look, we went in there and we always take an initial vote. And they took an initial vote, and 9 jurors were for guilt, 2 jurors were for not guilt, and 1 juror was undecided. And he said we went through the evidence, and 45 minutes in, it was all 12 not guilty, or all 12 guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
There were 2 at that point before going and deliberating the jury.
Yeah, they said they said, look, we felt like the prosecution is not beyond a reasonable doubt. And they just start going through the evidence. But 45 minutes in, basically, I mean, it was less than 3 hours, but according to this juror, 45 minutes into deliberations, after we started going through the evidence, it was like we took another vote, and it was 12 guilty.
Interesting. That's not unusual? When 2 people say, I don't think you proved it behind a reasonable doubt, and then 45 minutes later you can change their mind. Is that unusual or is that normal?
No, I think it's normal. When you go back there, you take an initial vote, and yeah, if all 12 jurors were like guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, I mean, I've had that happen in trials, but they still feel like, okay, 12, we took a vote, it's definitely guilty. Maybe we should go through the evidence a little bit. I've only had one trial that I did where all 12 said guilty. I mean, literally before the door hit the deliberation room closing, they were coming out saying we're ready to go home.
So, Thomas, I'm speaking from obviously not the expertise that you have, but I've had a lot of conversations with people, water cooler conversations outside the radio show about, hey, do you think he's going to be found guilty or not, right? I was one of those people that thought he was going to be found guilty, but a lot of people that I spoke with that don't have the expertise that you have were telling me, no, I don't think they proved it beyond a reasonable doubt, and they compared it to OJ in this sense. A lot of people, and I'm talking about not Powell Station OJ, I'm talking about double murder situation. A lot of people felt like, listen, OJ got off because the prosecutors didn't do their job. It wasn't beyond a reasonable doubt. There were screw-ups with the investigation, yada, yada, yada. And I said, man, I thought the moment that Murdaugh testified, and I thought he made himself look like a clown and he hurt himself further by testifying, to me, that was the end for me. And again, I'm someone that does not have the expertise that you have. But
he had to take the stand, Brian. But he did not do a good job when he was on the stand. He had to take the stand. One of the juror that came out and did the interview, he said, look, when Murdaugh took the stand, the case was a wrap right then. They said, well, what do you think about his crying? He goes, he didn't cry. I was sitting as far as you're sitting from me, Brian. The juror said, I'm sitting away from Alec Murdaugh. And he didn't cry. All he did was blow snot. Right. He's like, I was sitting that close, not a tear welling up in his eye. And that he showed no remorse or compassion while he was on the stand, and that his lies just nothing was making sense. So he did himself no favors, and I actually don't think he did a good job on the stand. The number one question he had to explain away was, why did you lie to police about not being at the dog kennels with your family? And it was only in November when they finally downloaded his son Paul's phone and they found a Snapchat where his voice was there. And the juror said when he got on the stand and admitted that that was his voice and he was there, Rap City. Like, his only saving grace would be to say that's not his voice on there, but I guess he couldn't say that. But he had to come up and explain, why did you lie about it? And I said, man, yeah. His defense attorney said, is that you down there at the dog kennels? Yes. Did you lie to police about it? Yes. Did you lie in your follow-up interview with police
Right.
about it? Yes. Why? And this was the pivotal moment. And he didn't have a good answer. All he said was, my drug addiction, coupled with police questioning me, coupled with having just seen my wife and son's body, all that together, I was paranoid, and I'm sorry that I lied, but I did, and I'm sorry about it. And I said, okay, well, that's not a good explanation.
Thomas, thank God that his son had that little Snapchat clip. That was a big piece to this case because obviously it proved Murdaugh
It was
lied.
a huge piece in the case, and that's because he filed a notice of alibi back in November. And so as a defendant, you file a notice of alibi. If you're going to put on an alibi defense, you can't spring that on the prosecution at trial. And what an alibi means is you were not where the crime took place. And you're going to bring in alibi witnesses because you give notice to the prosecution so that the state or the government can then investigate and be ready to combat your alibi defense. And so he basically filed an alibi defense saying he's not there, and then it comes out that you were there and that you've been lying to police about it for a year and a half.
Yeah.
That was, to me, an insurmountable hurdle. If not for that, there was a lot of, I'm surprised the jury came back as fast as it did. I thought there was some reasonable doubt there, but jurors don't like defendants that lie. And when he took the stand, the whole jury thought he was lying. The judge, even today at sentencing, said, basically, what you were saying was not credible on the stand, and the judge said 99% of this people who watched the trial know that you weren't credible on the stand. And one thing the judge pointed to was, how could you say that this was just another day in your life, that you were just having fun with your family when, number one, your father is on his deathbed, he's switching to terminal illness. Number two, the CEO at your law firm has just confronted you at work, that they know that you've been stealing client funds, they want to know about it. And number three, you also have this pending lawsuit with the discovery being requested by the civil attorney on the other side, which is going to expose all this financial fraud you've been doing. And so with all those things combined, how can you sit on the stand and say this was just another day?
Well, I agree.
It was just a good day. And the judge said, I found that to be completely not credible.
Yeah.
And the explanation for the lie, it just did not pan out. I said, look, what's your reason for lying? I was on drugs and I was paranoid. Okay. And I think this is what the judge said. This is what the prosecutor said in closing argument, especially in rebuttal. I think Creighton Waters hit it home in rebuttal. I didn't like the initial closing by the prosecution, but he goes, it doesn't matter if you have some pills in your pocket. That's what he was saying. I had pills in my pocket when I was being interviewed by police. I was paranoid about that. He goes, when your wife and son have just been murdered, you don't care about the pills in your pocket. You're not caring about any of this other stuff. You tell them, I was there. I saw him minutes before I just left. You make sure you tell police that. You don't sit there and say, I'm paranoid. Now I got to cover my tracks. And that right there was, the juror who got interviewed, they said, look, the timeline was real tight for him to get all this done. To shoot them, to dispose of the weapons, to wash the blood off of himself, to change his clothes, go to his mom's. All those things combined, there wasn't a lot of time. And the juror said, we think that there was just enough time to get all that done. The other damning piece of evidence that was really hard for him to explain away, which they had no explanation for, is his wife's phone was basically out off the road, like it was thrown out the window. And it looks like that's the path that he drove to his mom's house after the murders happened. And so it's like, how did the wife's phone end up out there? It was very easy for jurors to find, and what the prosecution argued is that he tossed it out the window.
Right.
Okay, so that was an inexplicable fact. And look, there was a lot of things in the investigation that weren't done right. And that's defense attorney 101, attack the investigation, all the things that they could have done that they didn't. And I'll tell you, that happens in every trial. And prosecutors are always like, God, I wish the detectives did this. I wish they did this. I wish they didn't do this. Why did they do that? We're going to have to explain all of that away. We deal with that a lot because detectives, most of their cases, if they do everything right, the guy does not go to trial. And if they do a lot of things wrong, a lot of times the guy does not go to trial. He gets a better plea deal. And only once in a while does a detective's case get put on trial where they see how a defense attorney rips them to shreds on everything that they didn't do, right? And that detectives learn from that. But they go to trials are few and far between, and a lot of detectives, they can go far into their career. This SLED team, these are very experienced detectives, and they did a lot of things wrong. But at the end of the day, the detectives aren't on trial. It's Alec Murdaugh. And despite the gaps in the investigation, the things that they could have done that they didn't, The jury found it was guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And why? Because he lied on the stand. But he had to take the stand. He just didn't do a good job.
It was a Hail Mary. He had to knock it out of the park.
Well, yeah, you have to get up and explain away this lie.
He
Once
didn't do it.
once the
Yeah.
prosecution did it, and I said this, I go, when I saw his first explanation for why you continued to lie, he goes, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave. But once I lied, I continued to lie." And the defense attorney was just silent for a second. He actually just dropped his head, and I was like, I'd be thinking the same thing. I go, "Didn't we prep better than this, Alec?
Yeah,
I mean, we
that was-
prepped your testimony for 3 days. This is what you're doing on the stand." And here's what I say. You take the stand, put yourself in the position of, if you were innocent and you were being accused of butchering to death your wife and son by shotgun and rifle, and you're on trial for it, and the real killers are out there, and you're standing accused like case is going to be closed on me, you're indignant on the stand. And I saw none of that from him. Why am I on the stand? Why am I being tried for this?
course.
I would never do this. How am I going down? But none of that, and like this indignant of, this is outrageous that I'm being charged here, right? There
None of
was
that.
none of that from
None of
him.
that.
And that was unnatural. And even the crying.
Even moments after the murder, when police arrived, you would think two things would have happened, which would have been a natural response. I'll name a few. Number one, he's going in and out of being emotional, but he's answering questions pretty precisely and calmly to police, like he already knew what he was going to say, number one. And the other thing I would say is, yeah, who did this? Who did this? Find the person that did this. Who did this? None of that.
He had
from this-
already concocted this story, and this was the theory of defense that they put forward, is that because his son killed this girl in a DUI boating accident a few years before, back in 2019, that there was a civil lawsuit, but because his son had not been brought to justice, I think the criminal case was still ongoing.
Right.
That there's some vigilante, that there were a lot of threats to his son, and that's what he was trying to tell the police, that was what happened. And that wasn't an implausible story for them to put forward. It really wasn't. The other thing I wanted to highlight when he was on the stand was this. This is completely unnatural, and I've seen a lot of defendants, when you get on the stand, it's the decision to cry or not to cry. And I'm going to tell you, if you choose to cry, it better be real, because jurors are watching. Like I said, that juror who got interviewed said he didn't cry. All he did was blow snot. And this was what was unnatural. You know what you do when you fake cry on the stand? What I see defendants do? They bring the tissue to their eye as they're dabbing the tears right at their eye, right? And that's because they can't generate the real tears to come down their face. So they're dabbing their eyes. But you couple that with the other thing he was doing. The juror said all he did was blow snot. If you watch his testimony, snot is dripping out of his nose. I mean, like a string just dripping down for seconds at a time, 5-10 seconds, just hanging from his nose, dripping onto his suit. And then he grabs his tissue and dabs it. And I say, okay, this is theatrical. It's melodramatic. You're trying to show the jury that snot's falling out of your nose. So you're not even cleaning the snot that's about to fall onto your suit, right? It's just dripping out of your nose. You're letting it happen, then you dab it. But when it comes to your tears, you're getting those right away.
Well,
and to me, I said, this is fake crying, and jurors don't buy it. And if there's any time that you should be crying, it's on trial for when you're bringing up the memory of finding your murdered wife and son.
Of course. So I'll give you an example that goes the other direction. And by the way, this is not somebody that I've ever defended, but I never said that Kyle Rittenhouse is a murderer, and he was found not guilty. I do believe it was self-defense. When Kyle Rittenhouse cried on the stand, I thought it was real.
It's easy to tell. If somebody's crying, are
Do
you
you
crying
agree
for
with me?
real, or are you crying? Are you not
Rittenhouse,
crying for real?
I thought it was real because he.
Well, I don't really want to compare it to Rittenhouse.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, look, I've seen a lot of defendants in my own trials that I watch here in Las Vegas.
Right.
I've seen the fake crying when they're on trial for murder. I've seen the real crying, but this was really took me back, because I'm like, how could you not even generate genuine tears? I mean, this is the murder of your wife and son. You're on the stand. How can you not, even if you're lying up there, how can you not go to a certain place to generate those
Reminded me of
tears?
Scott Peterson a little bit. I think you don't even have to be an attorney or practicing law. Obviously, you've seen this sort of stuff all the time. But as jurors, I'm like a juror. I don't have, I'm just watching. I wasn't 5 feet away from him, but you could tell. I agree. This was fake. This was not real emotion.
It was nice to see the juror actually say that, because I'm watching on TV and I go, this looks fake.
Yeah.
But for the juror to come out and say, because the reporter said, well, he was crying. He goes, he didn't cry. He didn't cry. All he did was blow snot. And I went, oh man, that's a great line right there.
I agree.
That's a great line.
All right, so if you're just joining us, we're talking about the Alex Murdaugh found guilty. We'll get to the sentencing here in a little bit. He was life in prison without the possibility of parole. But
Yeah, so 2 consecutive life sentences
Right.
here. The sentencing, I think what the judge did at sentencing today, and I was surprised how quickly they sentenced in South Carolina. They were ready to sentence right after the trial. They said, "Oh, the judge delayed sentencing to see if any victims wanted to speak at sentencing." I'm like,
Yeah.
as soon as the verdict comes in, you try. I was like, there's a lot of
Yeah.
jurisdictions where sentencing gets kicked out a month or two so that
Yeah.
the defense can present mitigating evidence, not just about the trial or you're confessing, but about his entire life leading up to that point. You're allowed to
Yeah.
do that. But I was surprised that South Carolina, they get right down to business, don't they?
Yeah, the next, I thought that was great. But yeah, I want to get to the sentencing with you because I think we might disagree on the sentencing, but we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, as you know, Thomas, it's almost like you're previewing a Super Bowl with all the sports analysts out there because all the attorneys and prosecutors, defense attorneys, and former judges, they're all saying, well, I think he's going to be found innocent or I think he's going to be found guilty. I'll play you one. Good old Judge Janine. She does a show on Fox News, and she's on Fox News a lot. This was Judge Janine hours before the verdict came in, and here's what Judge Janine had to say on her prediction.
Something. A verdict in a criminal case, a murder case, any criminal case has to be beyond a reasonable doubt unanimous. I would bet my house that there's one person who's going to hang on this jury, if not more than one person.
All right, so Thomas, do you need a house? Because Judge Janine said she's going to give her house away.
Well, that's a big gamble. I'm sure if she actually made that bet, that's like when you're playing poker and you're like, I'm all in, and the guy insta calls you and you were bluffing. You're like, oh my God. Because when that jury says we're ready within 3 hours, you already know. And I thought the deliberations would be a little bit tougher than they were. But I think the jury went back there and they're like, he couldn't explain away his lie. That's what it really came down to. So I actually thought this might be a hung jury. I did. I thought there was enough because, look, you have the 2-shooter theory. Why would a guy grab his shotgun and then also grab a rifle when this is going to be a very quick killing? But I guess the jury said, well, he's trying to make it look like 2 shooters. That's why we have a jury system there.
I get it.
I also said, about the blood splatter. And these are close-range shots. How are you able to wash all of the blood off of your body that quickly to where you're already on the road to your mom's house? I was like, okay, that's a tough one for the prosecution to overcome. The motive, I thought, was very questionable. The prosecution's whole motive in closing was the storm was gathering and it was about to rain, and that's why he killed his wife and son. But look, he didn't stand to benefit financially from it. And one thing that I thought the defense did really good in closing, which they opened the door to the roadside shooting, which was a huge mistake by the defense. They didn't mean to do it. But the roadside shooting coming in, where he actually tried to have a drug dealer kill himself, so Alec Murdaugh's life insurance money go to his other son, I think the defense made a good point. Go, look, that's when the storm is coming, you don't go kill your wife and son for it. And look, the guy tried to organize basically his own assisted suicide 2 months later, way before he was ever charged in this case. He still wasn't even charged in this case. He wasn't even thought to be the main suspect really in that case at that point. He tried to kill himself. That's what you do when the storm is coming. And it's hard for a juror even to believe, like, you could go kill your son and your wife in this fashion, especially with all the testimony that came out. Everybody who testified in the trial said Alec loved his wife. He adored his wife, that they had a great relationship. So to me, I thought jurors would come out and go, the motive doesn't make sense. The timeline, and if you really look at the timeline and dissect it, it's real tight for him to get everything done the way he's done. And there's a lot of people out there who think, and I would give a little credence to it too, that maybe there was other people who did do the killing, but Alec Murdaugh was involved somehow, right? Because a lot of things just didn't make sense. But at the end of the day, when that Snapchat video came out and put him at the scene just minutes before the crime, and his wife's phone is sitting out there in the woods along the same path that he was driving, and then his explanations when the prosecutor got him on cross-examination said, well, start explaining all your steps that you took with your cell phone before you went to the house. And Alec Murdaugh was like, well, I think I did take a nap. Well, your nap would have had to have been like 5 minutes. He goes, maybe it was like a 30-second nap. I don't know, 10-minute nap, 20-minute nap. It's like, look, man, like you have, like the prosecutor said, you're explaining away everything that you were prepared for and everything you're not prepared for that I'm asking you. You don't have an answer for. All of a sudden, your memory gets hazy on it. But I was surprised. I thought the jury would sit out for the weekend. I mean, at least in trials where it's rock solid, the jury sits there and goes, let's at least go through all the evidence with each other again and talk about it. But to come back that quickly on a case that took 6 weeks, wow. They went in there and it wasn't hard for them to make their decision.
Yeah, in regards, as I was saying to Judge Janine and what she said, and what a lot of others, she's not the only person that thought that there was going to be a hung jury. But
Well, I was following Law and Crime. There's a lot of people going not guilty in that Law and Crime feed.
Right. But my perspective is all it takes is one idiot. What I mean by that is a jury.
Well, let's talk about that,
All
right?
it takes is one person that thinks that Murdaugh, and there were 2 people, by the way, that didn't think the prosecutors, as you mentioned,
Initially.
thought initially.
Initially,
But all it
that's their
takes
vote.
is one, I'm going to use this term, stubborn, ignorant, whatever the case may be. All it takes is one person out of those 12.
Well, there's some pushback on that too. Sometimes they say, F. Lee Bailey, a famous defense attorney, he said when you're talking to a jury, you're usually talking to one person, maybe 2. And that's because there's a 4-person. As attorneys, we usually bet on this during the trial. Which juror do you think is going to be the 4-person? And the strongest personalities emerge. And there's one person on one camp and maybe a second person in a second camp. And they're
Right.
fighting against each other trying to sway the jury. And a lot of other jurors just kind of go along with it.
Yep.
What was really funny in this trial is, I don't know if you knew this, but it was the day before one of the jurors got dismissed and an alternate got put in, and she was dismissed for juror misconduct. And what the judge said was, look, they've brought to our attention that you've talked about this trial to other people outside of the jury, and some of the other jurors said you have mentioned the trial to them. You're not supposed to do that. I'm not saying you did anything intentional, but you need to be off the jury. And what came out is her discussions with other jurors was she thought Alec was not guilty. So the defense team lost a really, really strong juror for them. And she might have been one of the crazies, because the funniest thing that happened when they went to dismiss her, they brought her in. They said, look, we're dismissing you from the jury. Not saying you did anything wrong, but we got to protect the sanctity of the trial. Is there anything that you left in the jury room that you need to get? And she goes, yeah, I got a dozen eggs in the jury room. And everybody started laughing. The judge says, eggs? Like, you have a dozen eggs? She goes, yeah, I have a dozen eggs back there in the jury room. And he goes, well, do you want to take them with you, or do you want to leave them here? She's like, I'd like to take them with me. And so right there, everyone goes, this might have been that cuckoo crazy juror that could have hung the jury, who could have held out over the weekend for the next week, to where the jury finally comes back and says, Judge, we can't make a decision. But I'll tell you, when a jury hangs, they make that jury deliberate in a trial like this for a week or 2. And they basically keep bringing them in, go, you have to come to a decision one way or the other. So there's a lot of pressure. And there has been trials where jurors have succumbed to that pressure, and after the fact said, I didn't want to go guilty, but they were all just riding me so hard back there that I changed my vote.
Well, it's
If that juror stayed on, she might have been the stubborn, not guilty that Alec Murdaugh needed. If you get a hung jury, it doesn't mean you're acquitted. You need 12 not guilties. It means it's a hung jury. That means you're going to get a retrial. And I'll tell you what, a retrial is never good for the defendant, because what happens is the prosecutors, it's basically having a dry run, right? It's like, hey, I see everything that we did wrong, that we could do better. We get to talk to the jury afterward and go, hey, what questions did we not answer for you? What was the reasonable doubt in your minds? And the jury tells them, and they go, okay, round 2, we're going to put on a better case this time. And we have Alec Murdaugh's horrible testimony from round 1. Should he choose not to take the stand in round 2, we have that. And if he takes the stand and tries to better his story the second time around, we have that. So they were going to try this case again if it was hung.
So this is the moment that I want to play. This is after the guilty verdict. So defense attorneys, they know that their client has been found guilty. This is before the sentencing. And what most attorneys, defense attorneys, will try to do in that moment is ask for some sort of mistrial. This is the judge's response to that request, and here it is.
Has now considered the evidence for a significant period of time, and the evidence of guilt is overwhelming.
And then he goes on and does not grant the request. Basically, that's what he said. He said the evidence is overwhelming. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, you're guilty, and there will be no mistrial. And that was the end of that. Outside of the courtroom, not too long afterwards, South Carolina's DA, Mr. Wilson, made some comments. Here's a little bit of what he had to say after the verdict.
I started off my remarks by saying that it is a good day in South Carolina. Today's verdict proves that no one no matter who you are in society, is above the law.
Now, why is he saying that?
A lot of people doubted that this process would work, and hopefully, for those who did doubt the process, hopefully we have instilled and put a little bit of faith back into you and your lives as you view this process as it unfolds.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Wilson, Mr. DA. Why is he making that statement? Well, he's making that statement because this is a well-off, well-known family, a well-known attorney in that district. People know who he is, and there are people in society, and I don't blame them for thinking this because it happens every day in our justice system where sometimes...
I didn't like the press conference.
You didn't like, well, let me explain why let's talk about that, but let me explain why I understand where he's coming from. There are a lot of people in this country that believe if you have money, money equals power, and if you have power, you are not treated the same, and you don't get the same justice that somebody who doesn't have money, who might be poor, who can't get good legal representation. I think what he was trying to say, and I kind of agree with this portion of it, is that, hey, this is a prominent family, this is a prominent guy, but we still got justice no matter how much power this guy may or may not have had. And I do agree with that message. That's a good thing. You know, we want to see if someone, no matter how much money they have, whether they're an attorney or not, a politician, justice needs to, you need to treat everybody equal, and that's never going to happen. But in this case, I think it was, and justice was served here. And I do agree with that portion of what Mr. Wilson was saying, at least that part of it. What do you like? What did you not like about?
I mean, they're treating like look, this is the legal system. You don't need prosecutors coming out there acting like it's a victory lap after, giving a press conference like they just won the Super Bowl. And that's what it was. You got Creighton Waters, you got the other prosecutor coming out. There's cheers and applause. They're just like, yeah, we did it. And, and look, this is a big-time media case. So, of course, this is important for these careers of these prosecutors, especially if they have any political aspirations. The DA himself came down and took a witness. And a reporter asked, like, why'd you take a witness? He goes, well, I asked him if it would help if I would take a witness, and he said actually it would. So, he let an old prosecutor come in. It's like, no, look, elected DA, you came down there, you took a witness in the trial because you wanted to get some clout from being part of this trial. And the press conference to me it stunk of that to me when, look, I'm a former prosecutor. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't come out and give a press conference like, we kicked their butts, didn't we? It's like, no, the system...
Inappropriate.
I thought it was completely inappropriate to come around. I get the message you're saying, like, okay, justice was served. It's a great day in South Carolina history for justice to be served. But to come out there and, like, have a victory lap like you just won the NASCAR?
I agree. I understand what you're saying. Let me ask you a question then. What if he did that as he started, talking about, hey, it doesn't matter who you are, justice is served. I think we both agree, nothing really wrong with that statement. And what if he just talked about the victims? We're glad we were able to get justice for the wife and the son, without holding, because I agree with you. I think that victory lap, and maybe it could be political aspirations, whatever the case may be. I agree.
They were in the moment.
Yeah,
it was in bad taste.
There are two people that are 6 feet underneath the ground now, and I wish that he took a little bit more time to talk about the victims and their legacy rather than taking a victory lap. But you would have been okay with that if he did that.
Look, you have to give a press conference. I'm just saying I don't appreciate, the prosecutors on the case, putting their hands up like we just won the Super Bowl, like we won the case. Like, prosecutors and attorneys in court, they put too much emphasis sometimes on winning when it's like, look, even if you came out there, if the jury went not guilty on you as a prosecutor, you still come out there and go, this is how the jury system's supposed to work, okay? The case wasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And maybe you hang your head and go, I could have done a better job. I could have done this and this and this better. But yeah, look, you're going to have that ego coming out of a trial, but I didn't like the press conference.
All right, I can understand that. I can certainly understand that. I'm certainly happy with the verdict, but here's what we're going to do. We are going to take a break, and here's what we're going to do when we come back. We're going to talk about the sentencing. It happened earlier today where Alex Murdaugh, the judge, sentenced him to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the two murders, two separate sentences there. So we're going to talk about that, why I disagree with it, and I have no idea if Thomas agrees with it or not, but I'll tell you why I disagree with it. This has been 7283. Okay, Thomas, so as we mentioned earlier, Murdaugh was sentenced to, he's going to be in jail for the rest of his life.
Well, before the break, you said that the death penalty was on the table, and I disagreed with you.
Yes, let's talk about that.
And so what I wanted to explain to you is that the judge, here's exactly what Judge Newsom said. He said, look, the prosecutors did not seek the death penalty in this case. And I don't disagree with their decision because that's the inner workings of the prosecutor's office and what they do. That's basically what he meant by that. And what happens is if prosecutors are going to seek the death penalty, there's a whole machinery that's going to happen that comes along with it. You have to file a death penalty notice. There's certain litigation that's going to happen because of the death penalty. The sentencing is going to be different. There's going to be different things in the trial. And the prosecutors chose not to seek the death penalty.
Right.
So because of that, the judge could not now impose the death penalty as sentencing and go, I disagree with prosecutors, I'm sentencing you to death. What Judge Newsom said is the prosecutors didn't seek it. I'm not going to disagree with that decision, but I'm going to say this. In South Carolina history, we've given out the death penalty a lot to people for lesser conduct than what I saw in this trial. And what he hinted at was, I'd give you the death penalty here. And then when he laid out his sentencing considerations about Alec Murdaugh being a lawyer in the community, Alec Murdaugh being a prosecutor in that community. Not only was he a civil plaintiff's attorney, but he also served as a part-time prosecutor in the community. If there was probably a conflict in the DA's office, he'd be one of those guys who would come in and prosecute cases. Given his family's history, his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, all being part of the prosecution and law enforcement in that community, that he should have been held to a higher standard. Then couple that with the fact that he came in under oath, lied on the stand. It was a completely incredible testimony. And I'm glad that Judge Newsom said that because people, I wondered what people thought, but when the judge is sitting there, he goes, man, I thought you were full of baloney when you testified.
Right.
And you're stealing from your clients. You admitted to that. Like, you violated your oath as an attorney. And then, look, I'm not going to tell you to confess because I know you need to appeal. So you got to maintain your actual innocence for you to try to appeal this thing forever, right? I don't expect that. And in my 22 years, I've never had a murder defendant come out at sentencing and go, all right, now that I've been found guilty, this is what was going through my mind that made me commit the murders that day. But you have a chance to do it. Do you want to say anything? And Alec Murdaugh, same as when he was on the stand, no indignance. If you're really innocent, wouldn't you be indignant after the trial? Like you're being sentenced? You're like, Judge, I'm innocent, not Judge. I mean, it's just like basically for the record, I'm innocent, just so my appeals can take place here. And that's what Judge Newsom said. Like, you're not taking any responsibility here. And I understand that you have your appeals, but maybe this is your chance to take some responsibility. What say you? And all Alec Murdaugh did was get up and say,
lie.
Well, he said, I'm innocent and I would never hurt him again. And then he even asked Murdaugh another question. He goes, what did you say on the stand again? Remind me. He's like, what a tangle web we weave. Right? Yeah. He's like, what did you mean by that again? He goes, oh, it was just such a bad testimony from him. But he repeated, he goes, well, once I lied, I had to continue to lie. And he's like, well, no, the weave was a lot more tangled than that. You've been weaving it for quite some time. And so when the judge handed out consecutive life sentences, meaning you're never getting out of prison, and these are consecutive life sentences, I wasn't surprised by that. He basically said I would have given you the death penalty had you had the prosecution sought it.
Well, the point, correct. The point that I was making, I think last segment was the prosecutors could have been on the table. The prosecutors, you're correct, decided not to go after the death penalty. All right. So it might give me like 1 minute here to give you my opinions on what I think should have happened here. And again, I don't come from a legal perspective, but I'm going to tell you this right now. You kill your wife and your son in the manner of the way this man did this, and he did do it. He is now a convicted double murderer. I personally do not believe you should be allowed to be alive. I personally believe that Mr. Murdaugh deserves the death penalty. And listen, I understand it's a whole can of worms how long you can be on death row and how much money it costs and all the appeals, 20, 30, 40 years. I get that. I hate that when it comes to our justice system. I really do. But I'm going to be honest with you. If you murder one person in this country in the manner in which Mr. Murdaugh did, I believe you should get the death penalty. Now, whether, legal ramifications, whether it could be met in court, that's a whole nother ballgame. I'm just telling you from a non-legal perspective, my personal opinion. If you murder two people in your family, the way this man did, this wasn't an accident. This was murder. It was double murder. I don't believe this man deserves to be alive. I don't believe he deserves to have 3 meals a day. I don't believe he deserves to maybe, even to be able to conversate with people. He doesn't deserve that. He deserves to die. And that's why I am for capital punishment. That's why I'm for the death penalty. Okay, I'm not for people stoning him to death or what they do in other countries. I'm just saying in this country, I want the death penalty. And I believe in this specific case, just like the Parkland case and some of these other cases, I think it's a joke. It is a joke This man should get the death penalty. He doesn't deserve to be alive. His son and his wife don't have any rights. They're dead. They're 6 feet underneath the ground. Alex Murdaugh should be getting the death penalty. He is a coward. He is a double murderer. He is a psychopath. And I don't believe, again, he deserves to be eating 3 meals a day. Now, the legal perspective is different. I understand that. There are mitigating factors. He was a drug addict. I get that. He was on drugs. I understand that. All these other things don't bring these two people back. I get it. He was a prominent member in the community. He was an attorney. He was taking all these pills. I don't care. I don't care. The bottom line is he murdered 2 people. There is no excuse for that. He doesn't deserve to be alive, and I'm going to stand by that.
Well, okay.
That's how I feel, man. That's how I feel about the death penalty in general. I feel like if you murder somebody, not talking about even a drunk driving case or an accident or even involuntary or even voluntary manslaughter, I am talking about cold-blooded murder, like what Tillis did in this city. If you murder somebody, and that's exactly what this was, double murder. There is no opinion on that anymore. This was a double murder. He's convicted. I'm sorry. I don't want these people rotting in jail. Yeah, I get it. You put them in a 5x5 or a 6x6 cell or whatever the case may be. That's torture. He's not going to get that. But I get it. Some people would argue, hey, it's more of a punishment if you're life in prison without the possibility of parole. I understand that argument. I really do. And I also understand the argument, Thomas, of, it takes 20, 30, 40 years to put somebody on death row and it costs the state more money. Like, I totally understand that. You know that better than anybody. But I don't think this man deserves to be alive. I really don't. I don't know how you feel, but that's how I feel. I just don't think he deserves to be alive. I really don't.
Okay.
Do you think this was proper, the life sentence without the possibility of parole? Is that something, as a prosecutor, you wouldn't have gone after the death penalty? Legally speaking, you wouldn't have gone after you would have done what they did, the prosecution in this case.
I think he's held to a higher standard because of his role in the community that he prosecutes cases and that, he was an attorney in the community. I think he's held to a higher standard. But, look, death penalty is reserved for the worst of the worst. And maybe you think this is the worst of the worst. Sounds like you think the death penalty should go for anybody who commits murder, if it's first-degree murder.
Case by case.
So
case by case.
I think life without parole is a pretty just sentence here. Mm-hmm. It's within the realm of reasonableness. I'm not going to sit here and get all up in arms that the guy's not put to death. For me, the death penalty, I would have put it on the table in this case because I would have tried. Well, I would try to extract a plea from him to life without having to go through the trial.
That makes sense.
That's what the death penalty. This is, so that's my stance on it. I don't find the sentence unreasonable.
But you would have gone for the. But that's interesting.
Only as a leverage thing.
As a leverage thing, so
only as a leverage thing.
Plea deal life without.
I'm not going. I got to put this guy to death as a prosecutor.
Yeah.
You have that mentality in the criminal justice system. You got to put everybody to death.
Well, not
You're going to be
everybody.
having 6 week, 7 week trials on everybody. And it's a lot of expense. And I'll tell you what. Let's talk about this. Now that he's gone to the trial, now that he is maintaining his innocence, we're going to have the appeals.
Yep.
And there were a lot of missteps made in this trial. There were a lot of issues that I saw brought up, even in the closing argument. I saw a lot of improper argument there. Is it going to be enough for an appellate court to overturn his verdict?
Right.
Maybe not, but there were a lot of mistakes made during the testimony, improper questions. Mm-hmm. I think that, what everybody's really harping on is the bad act evidence of his financial crimes against his law firm, that could be an appealable issue. And it is, but I think he kind of ruined that appeal by taking the stand himself, because what happens when you take the stand as a defendant, your credibility becomes an issue.
Sure.
And, of course, you stealing from all of your clients at your law firm has a big evidence of your credibility, and it goes towards that. So now that he did that, I think the judge's decision to allow the prosecutors to get in that as to motive, because that didn't really make sense to me. That you're stealing from your law firm, so you're killing your wife and son to buy time. Yep. That to me, I haven't seen any appellate case law considering you admitting someone's past financial crimes against them to prove motive when they're not really going to make money off of the thing just to buy time. So that was going to be an issue on appeal, and it still will be. And improper closing argument. The word liar was thrown around a lot. And I understand he admitted lying. So maybe that could be a difference. But as a prosecutor, you're not supposed to judge the credibility of the witnesses. The jury. So you make arguments couched like this. You don't say, he lied. He lied. That's what Creighton Waters is pointing at. He lied. He lied. No, you get up there and you say, look, he admitted that he lied about this. He admitted he lied about this. And now he's on the stand. Sure. This is the story he's telling you. And do you find his evidence credible? You know, because he's inconsistent here, he's inconsistent there. But for when a prosecutor gets up there and starts calling a witness or a defendant a liar on the stand, that's usually a big issue on appeal. And the reason why this becomes even a bigger issue is because this was a circumstantial case. You know, I know the judge said the evidence was overwhelming, but really, the evidence wasn't overwhelming as, like the judge said. I've had people who confessed to police and then still maintain their innocence at trial and at sentencing. And they confess. We have them on a recorded confession. You know, here you don't have that direct evidence, so it is circumstantial.
Understood.
And appellate courts are going to be looking at this going, this guy got life without parole. What were the problems in this trial? What were the issues in this trial? We're going to look at it. And it could not be the first appeal, but maybe a federal court 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line can look at this stuff, and you have a federal judge reverse it. And I've seen it happen a lot. I've had cases where I was still in law school before I went to law school when I was a prosecutor, came back on my desk from 25 years ago going, federal judge just overturned this because of problems here, problems there. And look, it was a big thing for the defense. Even the defense's mistakes are going to be appealable issues, right? The defense opened the door to the roadside shooting. They didn't plan on doing that. They didn't want to do that. His appellate attorneys down the line are going to go, that's ineffective assistance of counsel. The fact that they were dumb enough to do that. Things that should have been done in the defense investigation that was not done, right?
Yep.
The evidence that they should have tried to get that was not done. So whenever a person goes to trial, whether you get the death penalty or not, whenever a person gets to trial, they preserve their appellate rights. And that's why I always explain to people that when I was a prosecutor and I explain to prosecutors now when I'm negotiating on behalf of my own clients as defendants, I go, look, you know as well as I do, that guilty plea on that paper where they come in and admit guilt, it's worth its weight in gold because they are waiving their appellate rights. We have closure on this case. This case is going to be litigated for a long time. And guess what? Maybe there is going to be a retrial on this. There could be, you know.
Could be, but I don't think there'll be a different conclusion to it. But let's see.
Like you said, it only takes one juror, right? So you had this jury, and then their best juror got kicked off with a dozen eggs in her purse, the crazy that they needed, and the next time maybe your jury's not as favorable.
We'll have to wait and see if that happens. We're taking your calls at 702-221-7283. It doesn't change my opinion about the death penalty in this case. I believe that he should have received the death penalty based on the crime. But what do you guys think out there? 702-221-7283. Let's go to Beatty. I believe Beatty is first up. Betty, I'm sorry. Beatty's not a real name. Betty, what's going on? Thank you so much for calling in. What are your thoughts on this?
The appeal process is going to be long, and I think they threw that in there just so that they could appeal it later, just in case he didn't get the death penalty. And you're coming from a more emotional side with it. You know, I'm conflicted because the emotional side of me wants to say, yeah, put him to death for what he did to his family. But the other side of me, the intellectual side of me says, no, he needs to, prison is no joke. But he'll do better in prison than most of the other prisoners because he has appealed cases. They're all going to come around him and ask him for legal advice, which he'll be able to get extra, he could start a business there. And it might be less, might be more of a cakewalk for him than an actual person going into prison.
I understand what you're saying, Betty. You're right. I do come from an emotional perspective, but I think I also come from an intellectual perspective, which is this. I try to put myself in the position of some of those family members in the last moments of their life. As you know, his wife and his son are now 6 feet underneath the ground, regardless of how he may or may not be treated behind bars, and I totally understand where you're coming from. As a whole, people will disagree with me on this, but I personally believe if you intentionally murder a person or persons, I believe we should be interjecting the death penalty more in society, especially with the DNA evidence and all we have these days. And I also believe that our justice system, putting people on death row for decades and decades, is an absolute joke and a clown show. It shouldn't take that long. You shouldn't be able to appeal as many times as people are able to appeal on death row. It's a joke. It should be implemented faster. The laws, in my opinion, and the rules need to change inside a courtroom when it comes to the death penalty. And yes, I do stand by. I respect your opinion, and I certainly respect Thomas's opinion. But my opinion is still as follows. In most situations, when you murder persons, it could be the Parkland shooter. How many people do you have to kill in order for someone to get the death penalty? I just think we're not implementing it enough, and that's just my opinion, Betty, on the whole situation.
Yeah, I understand it, and in retrospect, I do agree with you. I do believe in the death penalty.
Yep.
And this guy was a prime candidate for it, but since the judge, since they've already ruled,
Understood.
Now he's going to be in prison the rest of his life.
Well, that's the good news, right, Betty? The good news is he's never going to be out in society again, and I think we all could agree on that, and we're glad that he was found guilty. Betty, it's good to hear from you. I really appreciate you calling in. Thank you so much. Have a good weekend, okay?
Thank you. You too.
Yes, you take care. 702-221-7283. I believe we have Elijah. Is that who we have next? Elijah's next on the line. Hi, Elijah. Thank you so much for calling in. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having my call. I appreciate it.
Sure.
I just had a couple comments regarding the last gentleman that had spoken on the death penalty. So, I think it's clearly, I think anyone that loves their family can assume and feels that this man did it. He's guilty of it. And most people come to the conclusion that he should, from a non-legal perspective, because I'm a criminal justice minor right now, about to apply for law school, so just giving you my framing on that. Mm-hmm. He's guilty, and most people would reasonably assume he should have the death penalty. But the problem I take with the other gentleman's commentary specifically is if we look at the amount of people, he's saying that the appellate process shouldn't be nearly as frequented and as allowed for individuals on death row. And I think if you look at the statistics of people that through DNA evidence and through other evidence that's come around through modern technology have been released from death row because they could definitively say they didn't commit those crimes, I just think it's really short-sighted to slam the death row button and say that everyone should be just kind of thrown on.
But hold on. I hear what you're saying. Let me just push back.
I want to clarify. It's not the other gentleman. You're talking to Brian Shapiro, the radio host. He's the one who said that.
So here's where I think...
my bad.
That's okay, sir. Here's where I think you're misconstruing what I am saying. I am not saying going back to before we had DNA. Like the Central Park 5 is a perfect example, right? They were found innocent, no DNA.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm not talking about putting all these people that have already been convicted when the laws were different. I'm talking about 2023. Right now, with the DNA evidence that we have now, it is almost impossible to have DNA.
There was no DNA in this case that was conclusive about anything.
Understood. But I'm just talking
so what's your
about...
point about it, though?
Well, he's talking about DNA evidence, and that wasn't my point. I'm not talking about cases that are prior. I'm talking about right now. And I will also say this. I don't think you have to have DNA evidence to give somebody the death penalty when there's also overwhelming evidence like there was in this Alex Murdaugh case. There's a lot of evidence in this Murdaugh case.
Circumstantial evidence at play, yeah.
Correct, yes. So I hear what you're saying. I am not saying that people that are on death row even 10 years ago, the DNA that we have now and the technology, I'm not even talking about that. If that makes sense, am I making sense, Elijah? I'm talking about right now.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying too. Absolutely. Listen, there are people, right, Thomas, that they've been found guilty.
Look, I don't feel like the evidence in this case was super overwhelming. That's why
the problem.
That's why you have.
If you look at the jury that was deliberating,
that's why you have attorneys out there who are commenting as if it's a Super Bowl commentary, going, "How is going to be not guilty or guilty?" People watching the trial. I watched the whole trial myself. I said, "Look, this guy." Basically, the jury said he's lying about this whole alibi when he got on the stand. But the evidence in the case, I mean, there's a lot of things about this case that did not quite make sense. But look, a jury unanimously says beyond a reasonable doubt you committed these murders. Okay. If it was a clean trial, if it can be held like that on appeal, that it was clean. There was a lot of things that were not clean about the trial. And I don't mean it was a dirty trial. I mean, as an attorney, as a judge, you're trying to make the trial as clean as possible. I think the Judge Newsom, sometimes he deflected issues because he just acted purely as a referee. Sometimes when a defense attorneys object or don't object, Okay, if they object, that preserves certain issues for appeal on a standard of review, and it becomes a lesser standard on appeal. But there's some things that attorneys don't object to that are still going to be reviewed on appeal and post-conviction that are held for plain error, and a judge needs to have his eye out for that. And I think sometimes he sat back and just acted purely as a referee sometimes, as if he's just, if you don't object, I'm just letting everything go. And some things
Absolutely.
I thought
Badgering
that
the
he should have been
witness, different things
addressing
of
a
that
little
nature.
bit more.
Yeah, so Elijah, I'll give you the last word here. Let me just add one more thing. And Thomas is 100% right? There's no DNA evidence in this case. But let's start, and again, I'm going
I want to say
the,
one more thing about the appeals process, though, is the number one reason why trials are overturned are jury instruction issues, okay? And that has nothing to do with anything that happened in the trial. It has nothing to do with the investigation leading up to the trial. It has nothing to do with litigation or objections. If there's a jury instruction that was wrong, then the case is going to be overturned. Now, I'm not sure how South Carolina does their jury instructions or not, but I was very curious about the entire process there. Number one, you read the jury instructions to the jury after the closing arguments of both sides, right? So the jurors are not even told what the law is until after closing arguments. Number two, you got these attorneys in closing arguments. They were commenting on the standard of reasonable doubt like crazy. The prosecutor got up there and said, hey, you got beyond a reasonable doubt is kind of like when you're making the most important decisions in life. That's what the defense said. And then you have clear and convincing evidence in civil trial and preponderance of the evidence. And look, if you have one reasonable doubt, I said, man, this is not allowed in most courtrooms around the country. You cannot quantify reasonable doubt. And they were doing that on both sides of the aisle right there. When what it is a legal instruction is going to come out and says, this is the definition of reasonable doubt. This is what you take back to the jury deliberation room. This is what you do. You don't have attorneys start saying, well, if it's an important decision, if you would hesitate in making the decision, that's reasonable doubt. I said, this is nuts. I mean, Creighton Waters got up there in his rebuttal and goes, oh, Blanca, the housekeeper, guess what? I met her in federal prison years ago. I recognized her. I said, this is not evidence in the case. What are you doing, man? So I looked at a lot of this. I went, man, I'm seeing errors all over the place. And I thought Judge Newsom should have interjected without an objection from the other side and said, hey, stop commenting on reasonable doubt right now, okay? Stop talking. Prosecutor, you don't say that you met this witness years ago in federal prison, that you know her somehow. Like, what are you doing? Talk about the evidence in the case. Stop calling the defendant, his testimony on the stand, a lie. Like, you can say where he admitted lying, that he's a liar because of the admitted lies, but don't say that his testimony, the jury determines whether that's a lie or not. So all of those improprieties, maybe it's not enough to overturn a verdict, but those are errors in the trial. I'll tell you, they could be deemed harmless errors, but there are errors, and no trial comes out where there's nothing called an error.
All right, so what was I saying?
Agreed.
Elijah, what was I saying earlier? Okay, I want to give you the last word, Elijah. But I just wanted to say one brief thing, if I may,
Of course.
when it comes to the death penalty. Then I'll give you the last word, and we have other callers on. If people don't think this should have been the death penalty, okay, fine. I understand that argument, and I totally understand what Thomas is saying. But when I look at cases like the Parkland shooting, where the guy, the animal admits to killing all those innocent people, he doesn't get the death penalty. The Buffalo shooter, who killed a bunch of people because they were black, he admitted to it.
I just don't get why are you comparing this Murdaugh case to these other cases?
Because I'm not in agreement with the death penalty as a whole. I don't like the way the death penalty is handled as a whole. And in this specific case, I understand how people can make that argument. It's my personal opinion that if you murder two people, even if there's no DNA evidence and you're found guilty, I think you should get the death penalty. And I'm just giving you the inconsistencies with the death penalty, and those are my frustrations with it. Go ahead, Elijah. I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I definitely, those inconsistencies are going to come state by state, absolutely. You see South Carolina is pretty quick to hand down the death penalty in previous cases in past decade or two for similar crimes, whereas a state maybe like Connecticut, California, not as quickly handed down for similar circumstances. And I think that the prosecution, I think the double life is a little bit easier to get across to a group of jurors in these circumstances than trying to convict with the death penalty.
Right.
That's just my opinion.
Sure.
But
I
definitely
that.
think.
I understand that, Elijah. I got to get to some other calls, my friend. I do appreciate you calling in.
Have a good day.
Thank you so much, Elijah. I get that.
Yeah,
I
I don't
understand
want
that.
to turn this whole conversation into death penalty being appropriate in all murder cases, though.
Well, I don't think, I don't think that. I think it's a case by case.
I don't want to turn this conversation into that.
Yeah,
it's kind of turning into that.
Right. All I'm saying is it's a case by case basis. I would never make that blatant statement. 702-221-7283 is the number to call, and again that number 702-221-7283. Let's go to Lori. Lori is next up on Pushing the Limits. Hi, Lori. Thanks for calling in. What's on your mind?
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I believe he's a liar. He's a cheat. He's a thief. I believe all of that stuff, but I don't think he pulled the trigger.
Tell me why. Why do you think that?
I think he was there. There's no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the fact that they didn't look into this opioid situation further, both sides maybe, or to bring in an expert. I have a son who was probably on opioids for about 10 years. And you looked at him, you knew he was on drugs. So you never had an expert come in and give any kind of idea of what the behavior would be, or what your body would kind of look like, what the characteristics would be of somebody who had a drug addiction for that long. Plus $50,000 a week, he'd be dead. He would be dead if he was taking $50,000 of opiates a week.
Yeah.
So then that kind of makes
$50,000 a month. I want to clear that up because a lot of people think $50,000 a week. Still an inordinate amount of money to be spent on drugs. Yeah. But I've heard the same thing, Lori, and I've thought the same thing too. That maybe he was involved down there, and there was some kind of other actors that were involved.
Yep.
But that wasn't a theory that was really put out there by the defense. They went with the theory of he wasn't there at all. But I think that was in the back of some jurors' minds too, that he's somehow involved in this.
I appreciate you clearing the up. I thought it was $50,000 a week, but even $50,000 a month is a lot of money. So that kind of takes me to the place, if you look a little bit around how he got to camp. I've done a little bit of research and found out that the gentleman who owned it before him owned a shipping company and brought in drugs from the Bahamas and got caught. Now, it sounds like Alex was maybe somehow involved in, I don't know, getting him off. I'm not real sure. I couldn't find a lot of information
about
that.
Let me ask you this, Lori. So I think your theory, but what would be the motive for them to kill Alex Murdaugh's wife and son?
Oh, cartels. He owed them money.
And why would he subject himself to double life sentences instead of trying to come clean with that at some point in the investigation?
Because he knows doggone well that if he messes with those cartels, they're going to take the rest of his family out.
Interesting theory.
So, cartels are nobody to mess around with once you get into that level.
Well, Lori,
and that's
go ahead.
Truly speculation, but I just don't believe that he did it. I think he was there. I think he knows more. But I think the other thing that's going to be very interesting is when Cousin Eddie comes to court and they got that drug trafficking issue going on, and see how that shakes out.
Well, Lori, I appreciate you calling in. We always love all sorts of different perspectives, and opinions, and we appreciate yours. And thank you so much. Okay, you have a great weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. 702-221-7283. And again, that number, if you want to be a part of the conversation, 702-221-7283 is the number to call. Obviously, the breaking news yesterday that Alex Murdaugh was found guilty of double murder. And then this morning, the judge sentenced him to life sentences without the possibility of parole. So he's going to be dying in prison. He's going to be spending the rest of his life in prison.
Well, he'll also be spending a lot of time in the courtrooms, too, because he's got about, 92 other cases in the pipeline for which he's basically admitted guilt. Mm-hmm. You got to think about this trial. What he admitted on the stand was he admitted to all these other crimes, which those other crimes would subject him to the rest of his life in prison anyway.
So can I ask you about that? And again, that this is the weird part of this whole situation, is that he already has life in prison. How can you punish him further?
No, you can't.
You can't, right? So it's like, you can't throw out the cases, right? There has to be justice.
Well, they could dismiss those cases.
You think they will?
No, I'm not saying. You said they can't. I said, no, you can dismiss cases.
Yeah.
It's judicial resources,
but it's like the guy's got life in prison already. It's like, what?
Or maybe you just get him to plead because he admitted to it on the stand, so the trial is going to be a joke anyway on those cases.
Right.
But here's what you got to think. All right, if a guy's already going to get on the stand and admit to crimes, which is going to subject him to a large amount of time in prison already, Why is he still trying to fight this case?
Mm-hmm.
And even when he loses, he's still going to maintain his innocence. Why? Because look, there's a reason why there was no victim impact speakers at the sentencing. Why? His family and his friends are still standing behind him. Remember, the evidence, I don't care what anybody says. The evidence in this case was not overwhelming. Like, oh my God, everyone's no, it wasn't like that. So people that were really in his corner are looking at it saying, man, the jury found him guilty, but I still wasn't convinced in a courtroom.
Right.
I tried cases for murder where the family had the guy's back and they sat through the trial. And by the time we got through the end of the trial, they went, he did do it.
Right.
Right. When they saw the evidence. So he's got people in his corner. And as long as he maintains his innocence, what makes his life in prison a little bit easier? Not only the fact that he's an attorney. So yeah, everyone's going to be coming to him to work on their appeals. But number two, if he still has his family come in for visits now and then, his other son come in for visits, his brother come in for visits, that's going to make that time go easier. So he wants to maintain his innocence. Number two, it's different going to prison as an admitted murderer and someone who is, look, you go into prison, everyone's like, I didn't do my crime. That's what they all say, right? And so there's a difference with being an admitted murderer and someone going and maintaining their innocence.
Sure.
Or if he had beat the murder somehow and he goes behind crimes for financial crimes, you're going to be treated much differently.
Yeah. All right. Well, there you have it. We're going to continue, of course, to monitor this, as Thomas has mentioned, and he's right. There will be appeals. He will be back in the courtroom. Well, actually, they can't appeal in this case, but what I mean is he's going to be in the courtroom for a lot of other charges that have been brought against him, which he's already admitted to, by the way. So he's going to be back in the courtroom. We'll have to wait and see how this thing plays out, and we will continue to monitor the situation. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break. And we got former prosecutor Thomas Moskal in studio.